Rachael Denhollander and Robert Downen. Welcome to the Courage to Face Failure podcast. This is the very first episode in a limited series focusing on a long-awaited, independent, third-party investigation into the mishandled sexual abuse allegations that are swirling around Southern Baptist leadership. And thus the name of this series, The Courage to Face Failure. Because what we're doing here today is talking about what got us to this moment and what it will take to have a different outcome in the future. This is a critical moment in America's largest evangelical denomination, but this process is not failure porn. This is a moment to face failure and summon the courage to create a better outcome. Southern Baptists are not the only group facing this problem, though, but they are taking the steps to change, and you are two important voices that got us to this moment. Rachael Denhollander, a well-known attorney, author, and advocate for abuse survivors in multiple fields, a name that burst onto the scene with the trial of USA Gymnastics Dr. Larry Nassar. And Rob Downen, an investigative reporter and one of the authors of the 2019 Abusive Faith series that documented this crisis within the Southern Baptist Convention of Churches, known more commonly as the SBC. As for me, I'm a documentary filmmaker and podcast producer currently directing a feature documentary about this story. I'm grateful you are both part of my film, but documentary films are not a quick process, and we are now at a pivotal moment. So I wanted to interrupt the filmmaking process to have you both join me here to talk about what's happening right now. This podcast exists to just talk about this moment for those who want to understand the importance of the report that Guidepost Solutions is about to give to the SBC's Sexual Abuse Task Force. Rachael, you're an advisor to this task force. What is the importance of this report? What are we waiting for?
This really is a groundbreaking process for the convention and for religious institutions as a whole. What we are waiting for is the culmination of a year-long assessment and investigation, an investigative portion that is looking into allegations of mishandling sexual abuse, of intimidating or harassing survivors, of resistance to reform, asking what got us to this crisis point so that we can do better going forward. And then also an assessment portion that's looking at the training and the structure and the policies of the executive committee to ask what can we do better, consistent with SBC polity, consistent with biblical principles. What can we do better in those areas so that we can prevent and respond better to sexual abuse? And I think this is incredibly important because it's really the first denomination to take this series of a step to really undergo this level of assessment and investigation. It's critically important because it's the response to survivors who have been advocating for change and for help literally for decades. And so to finally see those concerns taken seriously, to see their voices heard, to see the messengers respond to what's been going on in the convention is a critically important step to take. And it's also groundbreaking because it's the blueprint, it's the template for what other denominations can do, hopefully proactively before they reach this kind of crisis point, to be able to do an assessment, to look for weaknesses, to be able to care well for those who have suffered, and to form a better plan going forward. And the willingness to accept expert help in these things is critically important because none of us are trained to be able to do everything, right? And so for the convention to take the step of saying, help us learn to do this better is just incredibly important.
Yeah, to understand the crisis that is unfolding now, you really do have to pay attention to the structure and the politics of the convention because that's the very thing that has been a roadblock for survivors who've been asking for justice. Rob, can you tell us what is this report investigating? What are you anticipating in your work as a reporter?
Sure. So this month we are expecting the release of this report that we have mentioned and is the reason we are talking today. The SBC's rules basically call that such reports have to be published a certain amount of time ahead of the SBC's annual meeting just to give people time to process it. And so what we're expecting is the findings of that report, which have been held under lock and key in secret. I won't speculate on what will be in that report, but regardless of what is in it, it is going to be an extremely important and historic moment for the SBC in the next few weeks.
As we talk about this subject, I'm thinking about all those that I've already interviewed for the film and their stories of bravery and courage and heartbreak and postponed justice. And I wish we could get into all that in this podcast series, but we're really looking at the function of this report. How did we get here? What do we expect in it? And to that end, I would really like to at least set the stage for people who may be unfamiliar with what's happening with a quick recap of what the Abuse of Faith series was. And if you can describe that and why that kind of shook the convention.
Sure. So I always want to be very clear when we talk about our reporting that much of what we put out there, much of what we found and published had been out there, had been reported, had been discussed in some form or fashion by Southern Baptists for 20 plus years. We really, in many ways, not to discount our work, but we really did just put all of it in one place. And I think that is a really important thing to understand about this broader problem, because child abuse was not something that the SBC was entirely unaware of. They'd faced warnings for years. And so with that in mind, in 2018, we started trying to collect cases of criminal cases, primarily involving Southern Baptist church leaders and volunteers. And we found that since 1998, roughly 400 Southern Baptist church leaders and volunteers had been credibly accused of sex crimes with children. They had roughly 700 victims, pretty much all of them children. And moreover, we found that in the lead up to 2008, when the SBC was meeting and was set to consider abuse prevention policies that other denominations had taken and that survivors said would better protect children in Southern Baptist churches, rather than heed those warnings, Southern Baptist leaders declined to act in 2008. And so our reporting focused on the 20-year period between 1998 and 2018, because that gave us a perfect bookend, 10 years before that 2008 decision not to do anything, and then the 10 years since. And so what our report found was top denominational leaders had either faced allegations that they mishandled sexual abuse claims, in other cases fully admitted to having done so, and in a few instances involving some of the most prominent Southern Baptists of the last half century, were accused in lawsuits and in news reports of committing abuses themselves. So that is what is at the core of this upcoming report, what SBC leaders did or did not know and how they responded to the decades of warnings that preceded our report.
So this comes out in 2019. And it seems like there was going to be some momentum coming up for the next convention, because Baptists meet once a year for 2 days, and it's usually in the summer. And here, just a point of clarification, in Baptist terminology, the delegates at this convention are called messengers because they're sent as messengers from their churches. But I remember when I first heard that, I'm like, who are the messengers? What's going on? I mean, trying to understand the convention and its policies and procedures is almost a full-time job, as I'm sure Rob can attest to, having had to jump into this in recent years. Rachel, tell us a little bit more about 2019 and how pivotal that was.
2019 was a critical moment for the Southern Baptist Convention. The Abuse of Faith series from the Houston Chronicle had really galvanized a lot of these advocates and survivors who had already been pressing on this issue literally for decades to come back up and say, essentially, we told you this was a problem. We've been telling you for decades this is a problem. You have to do something. And the messengers and convention leaders, it just put everybody in a position where they couldn't as easily walk away anymore, just because of the work that Houston Chronicle had done and that these advocates and survivors had been doing. The biggest issue that survivors have been pushing for is you have no mechanism to be able to report abusive clergy, and you have no mechanism to be able to say to churches that are covering up sexual abuse or putting pedophiles in the pulpit that we're not in fellowship with you anymore. The convention is a group of autonomous churches that have come together to fund education and mission work and a set of stated goals. But there was very little mechanism, really no mechanism, when it came to sexual abuse for saying to a church, you're not in fellowship with us anymore. There were some mechanisms for doing that if other aspects of the convention policies or the Baptist faith and message were violated, but there was no mechanism for doing that with sexual abuse. And so convention leaders put forward a couple of key things to sort of set the stage for where we are. They put forward a resolution called Resolution 21. And that resolution essentially says if you have engaged in sexual abuse, you're disqualified from pastoral leadership in the convention. And then also urge that churches also not put those individuals who have committed sexual abuse in any position of power or leadership. And that was the first time the convention had really put that stake in the ground. And so Resolution 21 was passed. And then they also created something called the Credentialing Committee. And the Credentialing Committee operates underneath the purview of the executive committee. And the credentialing committee's job is essentially to vet allegations or concerns that churches are out of step with the standards of the Baptist faith and message and of the convention policies and rules. And so that's not limited to sexual abuse. And there are only very narrow things that would kind of trigger that response. And so they put sexual abuse under the purview of the credentialing committee, along with other questions of being out of step with the Baptist faith and message, and gave the credentialing committee the ability to make inquiries. So if they receive a concern that a church has transgressed some standard or boundary that the convention has set, the credentialing committee has the ability to make an inquiry, not to investigate, but to make an inquiry, and then to come to a conclusion about whether or not that church has violated the standards that are required to be part of the convention. Sexual abuse became a part of that. But the credentialing committee was given almost complete discretion in what questions they would ask, the processes they would follow, who they would or wouldn't listen to for advisors, what level of transparency they would and wouldn't have, and even what boundaries they would have related to sexual abuse. So outside of the standard of, hey, you shouldn't have a pedophile in the pulpit, the credentialing committee had complete leeway to set any kind of other boundary or standard related to sexual abuse. And so that kind of kicked off that process in 2019.
Rob, what do you remember of how well that credentialing committee process worked? And then what were some of the results?
The earliest response to our stories came a week after we published in February 2019. And then SBC President J.D. Greer called for, Rachel used the word inquiries, and I think we can loop back in on why that's important here. But, inquiries into 10 churches that were named in our report, basically saying that they should face some sort of scrutiny from the SBC's executive committee over, allegations that we had outlined that they had allegedly mishandled abuses. And a week later, the committee that was tasked with doing that came back and said, basically that there's nothing we can do to investigate these churches, to make these inquiries because of the denomination structure. And because of the constraints of the committee's power, it really was toothless when dealing with pretty much anything other than someone who was convicted of sex crimes and was still on staff.
Can I jump in for a quick second? I don't think it's actually accurate to say that they couldn't do those things because of the constraints of power. They had discretion to do good inquiries. They just kind of chose not to.
Right.
And I think that's kind of part of what we're going to be pushing on this year is
Yeah.
you can do an inquiry properly. You can set better boundaries and standards for what it means to be out of step with the SBC. And I think that's kind of part of the sticking point is they're saying they can't. And I think they can.
The issue here is justice for those who've been wounded in the church. And there was one entity that made an effort to listen to this and to respond. So we see the SBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission change their 2019 conference to come up with something called Caring Well, which was an attempt to address this crisis in the church. So, Rachel, when that invitation came to you, what do you remember of that moment?
It was a real mixed bag of emotions, if you will, for myself. And I think for so many other survivors, for a couple of reasons. There was an element of hope that they were trying to do something. And a number of the people who they invited to speak at that conference were people whose voices needed to be heard. Boz Chavidian, Diane Langberg, experts in the field of church sexual abuse and church-related trauma and power dynamics who have been leaders in this movement and who are trusted by survivors and the community and who have a level of expertise desperately needed by the convention. And so it was encouraging to see those names on the list of those who had been invited. At the same time, there was just also a recognition that this is just the tiniest first step. And that there were critical pieces that were still missing from that standpoint. And so it really was a very mixed bag of emotion for survivors. I opted to go and to speak and to engage with that because I think those are important steps to take. And anytime you have the ability to speak the truth, I think it's good to take that ability. So I'm grateful for those good things that did happen insofar as they did. It wasn't nothing. But I also want to recognize that it was just a very first step and that there were some key things that were missing from that as well. And that I do think in some quadrants, it created this feeling of, well, now we've done it. We've done the educational conference. We've put the right people in front rather than realizing truly that this needed to be a continual effort of learning from the right people and bringing those voices into the convention and platforming them and learning from them. I think some of those dynamics were missing in ways that we've seen play out clearly in the last couple of years.
So, Rob, how did you feel about seeing the Caring Well conference get launched in such a short span of time in response, presumably, to this series?
Among the first steps that the SBC took, I don't think anyone would have any objections with church leaders and church pastors and church members, meeting for 3 days and talking about prevention policies and getting a real, extended conversation about how to better care for survivors and better protect their churches from abusers. But I think while that is a good step, I think that obviously amongst survivors, there's been a strong call for a type of denomination wide examination that would look at how the SBC would explain their decades of inaction on this issue. And, going into the Caring Well conference, there was obviously a lot of apprehension amongst the survivor community about, is the ERLC going to control who says what, are they going to review what we're saying, these types of things. And the ERLC, by and large, just gave survivors an open platform to talk about what they wanted to. So, Rachel in a panel with Russell Moore noted a recent sexual abuse case that was reported in Baptist press. A woman, high ranking denominational employee, had gone to SBC leaders, including Baptist press, about a sexual assault by a seminary professor. And Baptist press characterized that assault as a consensual affair. And despite repeated pleas, the SBC's executive committee, by way of Baptist press, did not correct what was clearly a mischaracterization of her abuse, and that compounded her trauma. So, Rachel bringing that up in 2019 was the first, I guess, moment in which Southern Baptists started to have reservations about the way that their leadership, both currently and formerly, were handling abuse issues. Obviously in 2018, there was a hodgepodge of scandals involving top denominational officials, including Paige Patterson, Paul Pressler, and Frank Page, some of the most revered and prominent people in the Southern Baptist Convention who had been accused of either misconduct themselves or concealing numerous rape reports. And so after our report, I think a lot of Southern Baptists wanted to move on from the Patterson and Pressler years. And, there was a changing of the guard in their national leadership. And that Caring Well conference really magnified that may not be the case. And that, I think, by and large, is what prompted the broader skepticism of leadership that brings us to today.
You know that when I invited you to come on this podcast, that I really wanted to just look back at the past year. What happened in the past year alone is enough to fill an epically long podcast episode. And yet it's impossible for us to talk about just what came from 2021 to today without going back in history. So I'm acknowledging here that we're skipping over a lot of stuff. And for people who are well versed in this history, they may be like, wait, you didn't bring up this and you didn't bring up that. And it's just impossible in one podcast episode to unpack that. But as we know, it was 2020. There was no convention that year. That led to 2 years of tension by the time we come up to the June 2021 convention. And there was a lot of drama that preceded it. Rachel, you've been monitoring this ever since you jumped onto the scene in 2018. So tell me a little bit about what you recall of this time period leading up to 2021's convention and all the things that happened beforehand.
So there were a couple of critical things that happened in that 2-year period. One of them was just the continuation of Jennifer Lyle's case, the survivor who had been defamed by Baptist press. There was continued advocacy to try to get them to accurately report the story and to protect her from the harassment that she was continually undergoing. There was a legal case that settled out related to that defamation by the Baptist press. But then there continued to be defamation by individual leaders in the executive committee. And so that really continued pushing things forward to a large degree and just elevating this question of how are survivors being treated? How are we responding to abuse allegations? And raising that question of if this could happen to one of the highest paid female executives in our denomination, is it possible that we've done this to survivors who we haven't seen? And that started raising the names again of Krista Brown and Tiffany Thigpen and Jules Woodson, these survivors that have been pushing for so long for the SBC to see what was going on. And Jen's case helped continue to move that out of the realm of, oh, that was in our past, to no, we're actually still doing it right now. And so going into 2021, there was just a significant number of questions continuing to be raised about what leadership was doing and how they were currently responding to abuse cases. And so I started getting reach outs by a couple of pastors who said, we want to do something. We know we need to get answers to these questions. We know we need help figuring out what to do going forward. These are some ideas I have. Can you help me get this in a good format? And so I sat down with two leaders individually. Todd Benkert was one and Grant Gaines was another. And we looked at what could be done under SBC polity, got help from experts who had sufficient knowledge of parliamentarian procedures, and just looked at what could be done to help get a better understanding of what's going on in the convention, to answer these questions, to bring light into where there's darkness, and to also just get some very good guidance on how we can better resource and equip churches. And the Credentialing Committee and the Executive Committee. And so out of that was birthed two motions. There was the motion that Todd Benkert put forward to do a denominational assessment, to be able to receive information and look for data and patterns and trends and analysis across the convention. Not an investigation, but just an analysis of what's going on, a place to intake information and kind of paint that picture. And then there was Grant Gaines' motion, and that's the motion that led to the report that we're going to see come out this month. And Grant Gaines' motion was to actually investigate the executive committee and to look at these allegations of mishandling sexual abuse, resistance to reform, harassing survivors, intimidating survivors. And embedded in Grant's motion was that they also wanted to be able, in this investigation, to look at the legal counsel that the executive committee was getting. Because for decades, one of the concerns that survivors had been raising is that most of the time, these allegations of intimidation or harassment or covering up abuse, mishandling abuse, that there's legal counsel at the heart of that. And so Grant's motion was to allow the executive committee to be investigated for a 20-year period, and to look into these allegations, including the ability to look at legal counsel that was being given to the convention.
Well, I had never been to or even watched an SBC convention before 2021, but I spent days glued to the live stream watching all that parliamentarian drama. But even the months leading up to it were full of dramatic tension, including the departure from the denomination of mega bestseller and Bible teacher Beth Moore and ERLC President Russell Moore. And as it's always pointed out, those two are not related. So Rob, tell us more about these bombshells prior to the 2021 convention.
Sure. So I think it's worth going back to, the 2019 meeting that the SBC had in Birmingham, which was the first meeting that they had in the wake of our reporting. And the night before the convention, or the annual meeting actually started, there was a panel. Rachael was on it. Russell Moore and Beth Moore were both on it. And the Russell Moore quote that kind of sticks in people's mind is, "A Southern Baptist convention that doesn't have room for Beth Moore doesn't have room for a lot of us." And by that, he was referring to, this growing, some would say bullying, number of SBC pastors who had gone after Beth Moore for what they viewed as her preaching to a congregation on Mother's Day. And Beth Moore was particularly outspoken about, her distaste for the Southern Baptist Convention's support of Trump, and because of that, kind of faced a lot of harassment, bullying, all sorts of things from the more fundamentalist wing of the SBC. And so going into the 2021 meeting last year, it was, 2 months or so after Beth Moore had announced her departure from the SBC, which was, I think the New York Times ran that on the front page of their newspaper to kind of put in context how big of a deal it was. And then, a month later, the letter Russ Moore had written a year prior was leaked to me and other religion journalists. And in that letter, Russ Moore, over the course of probably 10 or 12 pages, just detailed what he said was a pattern of intimidation, a pattern of concealment, a pattern of inaction, a lack of motivation, to put it plainly, on the part of some SBC leaders to actually address the abuse issue. So at the same time, they were holding the Caring Well conference and pushing through some very basic, and modest reforms. There was, according to Russell Moore and a number of other SBC leaders, a whole host of SBC executive committee members in particular who were behind the scenes, not just pushing back against reform, but actively retaliating against other SBC leaders. And so the departure of Beth Moore, followed by Russ Moore, and then the letter that was leaked, really thrust a spotlight back onto the allegations of institutional attempts to conceal or suppress abuse reports. And so that kind of galvanized a lot of people going into that 2021 meeting. So, because obviously, you have top SBC leaders saying, oh, at the end of the day, the mission of this convention is to evangelize and win souls. And at the same time, you had, 15,000 church delegates saying, hold on, yes, that is our goal, but that does not come at the expense of abuse survivors, and trying to intimidate people who are outspoken on the issue is not an adequate response to the abuse issue more broadly.
And part of what was so groundbreaking about that letter was that it brought all of these issues into the present, and it unveiled the reality that it wasn't just happening to sexual abuse survivors. Now, that should have been enough. But Russell Moore's allegations were there is this continual pattern, there is this concerted effort behind the scenes with SBC leadership, as he alleged, to intimidate, to harass, to silence sexual abuse survivors and other SBC leaders who come to their aid. And one of the allegations that Dr. Moore raised in that letter was that the ERLC had been voted to be investigated, essentially by the executive committee, and that was retaliation for him allowing me to raise Jennifer Lyle's case publicly. And so the letter was just filled with very specific allegations of this concerted effort in SBC leadership to not only target sexual abuse survivors, but also to target anyone in SBC leadership and any entity within the SBC that came to those survivors' aid. And that really sparked alertness to what was going on and a desire for truth and for answers.
Yeah, I remember that time because when that letter came out, there was such a flurry of response in social media. And there was this sudden surge of registrations for the convention. There was a conservative faction who had adopted a pirate motif and the slogan, "Take back the ship." And so when the surge came out after Russell Moore's letter was leaked, I was wondering, is it the pirates mobilizing for their raid? Or was it a surge of people upset about Russell Moore's letter? And at the time, I don't think anything was sure. Rob, this was an historic size of the SBC. So tell us about that and tell us a little bit more about these pirates.
Sure. The 2021 meeting was among the largest that the SBC has had in years. Granted, some of that obviously was just because, people had been cooped up in their homes for 2 years because of the pandemic, but also there was and continues to be really a group of Southern Baptist churches. They've branded themselves the Conservative Baptist Network. And what they have been saying is that the SBC and its leadership are drifting towards liberalism theologically, politically, et cetera, despite pretty much all polling I've seen showing that the SBC is about as conservative theologically and politically as it's been in a long time. And so this group of churches continues to rally around issues that they see as, liberalizing the SBC more broadly. They've really latched onto critical race theory as an issue, the idea of, women as pastors, which is something that they say is happening frequently, despite it being a very, very rare instance generally. So going into that 2021 meeting, you not only had a recently historic number of Southern Baptists who had showed up to this meeting, but you also had this landmark meeting where they were yet again trying to decide which path they were going to take.
Yeah, I remember watching when Todd Benkert stepped up to the microphone and he basically had to call for the nuclear option for a floor vote. Rachel, can you describe for us exactly what he was calling for? What was the implication of what happened right after that?
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, correct me if I've got this wrong. But in that moment, what certain individuals had attempted to do who did not want this investigation to happen was to move that it be referred to a committee and then to allow that committee to unilaterally decide whether or not they would execute the resolution by the messengers. And so Todd stepped up and requested a floor vote so that that couldn't happen, so that there had to be an up or down decision and it couldn't just languish in a committee by referral. And when he did that, messengers voted for that motion by an overwhelming majority, which was really just a groundbreaking step for the messengers to say and to require a level of accountability and transparency out of their leadership that has not been required to date.
Rob, you were there actually at the convention. So what do you remember and how do you recall this going forward into the investigation that is now underway?
of the many votes that were taken over the course of that meeting, it was, in my reporting, described it as borderline unanimous. And I think that's really important to note. One, not just that Southern Baptist Messengers, 15,000 people moved forward this investigation into their top leadership body, but also that they then turned around and said, not only are we calling for this investigation, but we want you to relinquish attorney-client privilege and open legal communications, 20 years of communications, to this third party that would be conducting the investigation. And a few months later, at the SBC's first executive committee meeting after that annual meeting, they were expected to take up what should have been, I think, in the eyes of many people, a routine vote to approve that they would relinquish attorney-client privilege as was demanded of them by the messengers. And rather than do that in that first meeting over the course of, I think, 3 or 4 weeks, I think they had 3 separate 9-hour meetings debating whether or not relinquishing that protection would expose the SBC to lawsuits, to all of these different things. And as those meetings continued, you really had, I think, arguably one of the most contentious moments in recent Southern Baptist history, because you had top leadership actively saying that they were not going to fulfill the will of the messengers, the church delegates, which is explicitly their job, their duty, and their sole purpose for existing. So over the course of those meetings, you not only had Southern Baptist leaders defying their fiduciary roles, but also in one meeting, a longtime SBC executive committee member said that his goal with the investigation was to vindicate other SBC leaders, including executive committee chairman Ronnie Floyd, who later resigned after they actually relinquished attorney-client privilege. So going back to what you're talking about how the polity, the structure of the convention is at the core of this, you had longtime Baptist scholars saying that if the SBC's executive committee failed to do this, they were effectively flipping on its head the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention and calling into question whether the denomination exists entirely. So what to many people seemed like kind of a weedy story about attorney-client privilege and document review powers really was a borderline existential crisis for the SBC, in which top leadership was actively pushing against and defying the will of the messengers and therefore their explicitly stated purpose for existing.
Yeah, I just remember watching all those live streams and thinking, but you were told that for the sake of righteousness and justice, we're going to have an open and transparent investigation that's not going to hide behind attorney-client privilege around this topic only. Not everything, just this topic.
And so the task force published quite a bit of just informational material on what this question is, why it matters, why it's important, published a legal opinion from a very high profile law firm that we retained to look into the question of what are the risks, what are the benefits. And so that all of that information is out there. But this question of how much access are investigators going to have to information, that's always the question. And this is why it's so important that they have access to all information. Oftentimes, when policy is being decided, when crisis response is being decided, there are attorneys who are involved in those communications. And an attorney-client privilege is supposed to protect any legal counsel you get from your attorney, make it so that it can't be discoverable by other people or in a court process. But the difficulty with that is that, one, oftentimes institutions will stamp things as attorney-client privilege that are not actually privileged material. We see this frequently done as a tool of obfuscation by institutions. You can look at the Nassar case, my case. Michigan State University did this when they were under investigation with the Attorney General for covering up sexual abuse. They stamped tens of thousands of documents as privileged. And when a federal judge reviewed those documents, they found only a few thousand of them were actually privileged. But it's a very common tool for entities to intentionally loop an attorney into the crisis response or the policy making so that they can try to stamp everything privileged and hide what's really going on behind the scenes. Now, whether or not that's occurring, you're not going to know unless you give investigators access to information. And then in addition to that, oftentimes we find attorneys giving very poor counsel in crisis response. And so you're not going to get to the root of the problem that you have if you're not allowing someone to actually see the problem as it's occurring. And one of the concerns that survivors have been raising for decades is that The SBC's legal counsel has been involved in so many of these discussions. Incidences of abusive cover ups or of direct statements made by attorneys for the SBC, Augie Bodo being one of them. That name's been out there publicly. Survivors have said, hey, the way this person is talking about survivors, the counsel that they're giving to the executive committee, the way they're directing the crisis response, that's part of the harassment, the intimidation. These people, these attorneys are at the center of what's going wrong. That's the allegation that survivors have been raising. And so the question was, are we actually going to do a transparent assessment of what's been going on at the executive committee? And if attorney-client privilege isn't waived and investigators don't have access to information, then what has effectively been done is you have obscured and covered up and obfuscated the vast majority of the actual data that we need to be able to answer that question. And as the law firm for the task force kind of laid out, that's actually often in violation of your fiduciary responsibility. It's not acting in the best interest of the organization to defy the will of your shareholders. And in this case, on a corporate level, the messengers, the convention itself, is the sole shareholder of the executive committee. So to defy the will of your shareholders is not in the best interest of your organization. To allow problems to fester is not in the best interest of your organization. When you have been told to pursue honesty and transparency because you're a religious organization that ascribes to those principles and you're directly defying those principles, that's not in the best interest of your organization. So it is potentially a violation of your fiduciary responsibility to not follow the will of the messengers and to not allow full access to information. And that was really the argument that kind of came to a head in that October meeting.
So, once the waiver issue was settled, the task force and Guidepost Solutions, who was hired by the task force, had a lot of work ahead of them. There have been periodic updates posted online during this time, but it's still a wait and see period for most of us. Rachel, you have the perspective of being an advisor to the Sexual Abuse Task Force. What can you tell us of this process so far?
Well, our role really has been quite hands off, and that's as it should be for a supervisory committee. The goal was to identify a firm to do the work, to make sure the contract was set up properly, and to be giving periodic updates and communications as appropriate. But in order for this to work well, the entity, in this case, Guidepost Solutions, has to be able to work independently. They have to be able to follow where the evidence leads. They have to be able to weigh the evidence and to do their job effectively. And so the role of the task force was essentially to get it set up and to let a good firm do the job that they're capable of doing.
Well, this has been a costly investigation. Baptist Press reported that Guidepost fees as of mid April were already at $1.7 million, and that the executive committee had voted in February to increase that figure to $2 million. They also increased the money set aside for their own legal fees from $500,000 to $2 million at that same meeting. Though I also read that they anticipate $4 million in legal fees. This is a lot of money spent on this issue. What does this signal, Rachel? And where is the Survivor Care Fund in this mix?
I think where the Survivor Care Fund is a really legitimate question that the SBC is going to have to wrestle with. I think one thing it does tell us is that when you let problems fester, it costs you more money in the long run. When you attempt to obfuscate, when you attempt to not follow the will of the messengers, it costs you more money in the long run. It is in the best interest of everyone to do the right thing and to do it quickly.
If I can just jump in there too, I think there has been a lot of attention paid to the price tag of these investigations and some people, questioning the cost of them. But what is $7 million to a denomination that each year takes in collectively via donations from their churches revenues that would put them on par with a Fortune 500 company? I mean, the SBC pulls in hundreds of millions of dollars from its member churches each year to fund its missions, its seminaries, et cetera. And so, yes, while there has been a lot of attention paid to the slowly increasing price tag of this investigation, $7 million is, I think, a drop in the bucket compared to $900 million that the SBC has flowing through its coffers each year. And I'm not alone in pointing that out, but as other SBC executive members said in those October meetings, it shouldn't be a question of spending a few $1,000,000 to better protect and be transparent about shortcomings when it comes to abuse.
Yeah, that is a helpful context, Rob. Thanks for bringing that up. And we've spent a lot of time on this episode talking about process and policies and procedures. And there's a reason for that. And that's because policy, process, and procedures are what we can analyze on a podcast. It's what we can talk about dispassionately. But I know from my film work that we've only scratched the surface of this issue, and there's this whole missing conversation about human cost. The survivors who courageously called their community to account are waiting to see if they will once again be disappointed. Rachel, can you describe for us what the survivor community is wrestling with? The late night calls you get, the unaddressed trauma, the overlooked calls for justice?
This is an incredibly painful process for survivors to go through because, again, it is coming on the heels of decades of pleading to be heard, decades of pleading with the convention to better protect children. And so often, the cost of moving these things forward is borne by the survivors who are reeling from the trauma that their church and the denominational leaders, in many cases, caused themselves. And then they're also carrying the weight of the reform, and they're having to retell their stories over and over and over again to bring the truth out, to bring the darkness into the light. They're having to relive that trauma and to carry that weight. And change when it comes is slow. And so to put survivors in that position of having to carry that burden and carry that weight and relive their trauma just to see the tiniest fraction of forward movement, that's an incredible ask to make. And I think one of the things that highlights is the importance of proactivity by institution leaders to take up that mantle of protection and of care for the suffering so that the weight doesn't fall on the survivors as it has for the last several decades.
In the introduction to this podcast episode, I talked about how this series is not designed to be failure porn, which is a phrase I've heard some pastors use in talking about other podcasts that are also out there. They're analyzing root cause problems in some of these churches, the problems with celebrity pastor culture, the problems with narcissism, the problems with abuse, spiritual abuse, etc. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that when we're talking about situations like this, we're not trying to bring down the church. These problems are quite evident to the watching world. They don't need this podcast or any other podcast to name that something's wrong. It's the church that has to be willing to look at the evil and name it. And I'm wondering, Rachel, because you've lived in this for so many years, how do you combat those charges when you hear, stop focusing on the failures of the church, talk about what's working right?
I think that's a really unbiblical approach. Scripture talks continually about the importance of bringing light into darkness, of speaking the truth, of rebuking and correcting each other when failure has happened. It speaks continually of the importance of holding leaders accountable for the purity of the church, for the purity of the gospel. It talks about what a pastor or a leader should be, that they should not break a bruised reed, that they are meant to be defenders and protectors of the flock. And so to begin asking those questions, are we doing what scripture has told us to do? Is our institution, our church, our denomination, is it looking like what scripture has told us it is supposed to look like? Are we following the biblical commands to raise our voice for the oppressed and the suffering? Are we following the biblical commands to have accountability and transparency and to be subject to wise counsel? And those questions are really critical questions and foundational questions for any institution to be asking, but especially one that subscribes to those biblical ideologies and those biblical principles. And so I think my response to that would be you can't effectively fix what you haven't properly diagnosed. So, on a purely practical level, if you want to do better going forward, you have to be able to know what you've done wrong. But if we're going to hold to biblical principles and biblical truth, then we have to desire accountability and transparency and the truth. We have to desire to raise our voices for the oppressed and for the suffering. And that's what this process is intended to do. It's not a hopeless process, it's a redemptive, restorative process.
And Rob, briefly, what are the next steps? When do we anticipate the release of the report? And when will it be presented to the full convention?
So the report is expected to become public about mid-May. Obviously, that is going to be the focal point heading into the SBC's annual meeting in June. At the same time, there are presidential elections. Ed Litton, who is the current SBC president, has taken the rare move of not pursuing a second term in office. So that does raise the stakes going into this meeting in June, even without what could or could not be in this report. So I've said before that it seems like every year for the last half decade, or at least as long as I've been covering Southern Baptists, the stakes seem to just get higher and higher heading into every single annual meeting. And I think a lot of that is going to revolve around what is in that report and the extent to which Southern Baptist messengers and delegates are willing to absorb and internalize the findings of that report, and in the hope of survivors, hold leaders accountable for any past failings.
Thanks to both of you for your time and insights here. This has been the first episode in the limited series, the Courage to Face Failure podcast. The next episode will be a discussion about what Guidepost Solutions actually reported. This podcast has been a production of Citygate Films. It was produced and edited by me, Carolyn McCulley. Music is by Kevin Graham. 2 more things to consider before you go. First, if you'd like to support the film project and amplify the stories of the survivors, you can make a tax-deductible donation to the film's fiscal sponsor, the Southern Documentary Fund. Go to southerndocumentaryfund.org and search for Out of Darkness in the project list to make a donation and receive a thank you credit in the film. Or visit citygatefilms.com and follow the link from there. You can also watch an introduction to the film on either website. Your support will help us tell the stories of the women who held their community to account. And practically, your donations will help us finish this film faster. Second, if you'd like to help a group of survivors travel to Anaheim, California for the 2022 Southern Baptist Convention this June, you can make a donation through GoFundMe. Search for the Help Survivors Get to Anaheim campaign on GoFundMe. It takes a lot for survivors to bear witness. Your donations to help them get there is meaningful. Finally, look for a follow-up episode later in May of the Courage to Face Failure podcast. Thanks for listening.